Okay, so next up, we have Anazelia. She is going to talk. She's getting up there. She's getting up there. She's going to talk about incentive mechanisms for promoting large-scale forest restoration through something. It's right on the edge here. Natural, neural, says something, regeneration persistence. Do you want this mic?
Thank you. And let's see if I can figure out how to use this pointer. Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which you're meeting today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today, I'll be talking about the role of incentive mechanisms in promoting active restoration and also natural forest regrowth, which is part of my PhD thesis. So when we start talking about large-scale restoration, the first question, or one of the first questions that come to mind is how do we meet the ambitious restoration targets that have been proposed by countries and organizations? There are many international agreements that are setting these targets, and they are quite ambitious. One example is the Bond Challenge, with about 350 million hectares to be restored by 2030. And the challenges that these initiatives face, they are linked to gaining scale, but also the financial limitations. So in Renee's presentations, she had that number, like 20% of the climate change can be addressed by nature-based solutions. But when we look at financing, these nature-based solutions are receiving about 5% of the money that we have been spending in climate change mitigation and related activities. So one of the strategies that has been proposed as a way to gain this scale that we need is the natural regeneration. And one of the reasons is that it can save costs. Up to 70% of the cost can be saved because it requires less planting or interventions on the field. But it still keeps a lot of the benefits for carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, and also benefits that are social with less risks in the implementation of this strategy. However, when we look at the forests that have been on the natural regrowth on Earth, like worldwide, we see that not all these forests, they persist over time. So there's a problem because landholders, they still keep clearing many of these patches, and some of them maintain the regrowth forests, but we don't clearly understand this behavior and why some do one thing and others do the opposite. So one strategy is to combine this potential for natural forest regrowth. And I think today or yesterday, WWF released a report saying that an area of the size of France has naturally regrowth in the world in the past years. So there's potential, but we need to understand how to make this forest to persist over time. So one of the solutions for that is to use incentive mechanisms that could be non-financial incentive mechanisms or market-based solutions, command and control initiatives to keep these forests on the ground after regrowth. And the incentive mechanisms, they have many factors influencing their success or in their implementation. And it ranges from governance, financing, the outcomes that the actors involved want to achieve, if it's forest cover increase or conservation of biodiversity. And other factors can affect the success, and some of them are land tenure issues, access to information. And the potential approaches, they are also, they can also vary a lot from place to place, and it could be including natural forest regrowth, persistence as well. But also, we see many interventions like active restoration, agroforest systems, silvopastoral systems, and even afforestation being implemented through incentive mechanisms. So to understand better how this is happening in the past years, we're conducting actually, this is preliminary results, a literature review on incentive mechanisms applied for active restoration and also natural regeneration. And we want to understand and identify which incentive mechanisms have been used to promote these strategies, the factors that may be influencing their implementation success, possible mismatches between the intended outcomes and what they're getting from it. So we investigated papers from 2010 to 2020 to see the current trend, because if we look back in the literature, we're going to have many studies focusing on the beginning of the REDD+, but it doesn't reflect anymore the current situation that we're facing now. And we covered about 20 variables and on financing mechanisms, the incentive mechanisms, and the supported approach by these initiatives, but also the factors affecting implementation, the intended and the reported outcomes. For these three items, the last items, we coded ecological, economic, social, and governance aspects to understand how it works. So these are the countries where the studies were conducted. And these high numbers in Brazil and China reflect large-scale restoration initiatives that have been using incentive mechanisms to guarantee the program uptake. And this is also a result of this literature review. We built this framework to explain better how the final recipients or the target public, that could be landholders, community associations, and users, have been targeted by incentive mechanisms that are managed by an intermediary that could be the national government, the state government, and that are offering as benefits the access to management rights for the land, or access to markets, payment for ecosystem services, or funding for community development. And there are many instruments that could be used, and sometimes in the literature they call it the incentive mechanisms themselves, but they are more instruments that are being used to implement these incentives. And these intermediaries, they have to get access to financing mechanisms that are broad scale and usually global, that could be REDD+ mechanisms or clean development mechanisms, grants or loans, and coming from private and third sector or government. So for this, they also need an instrument or an agreement, could be a certification type of agreement. And it's interesting to see that the outcomes that these actors want, they vary across the scales as well. So the global outcomes would be more related to climate change mitigation. In the regional scale, they can be looking for improve the livelihoods in the landscape. And at the farm scale, the farmers or the landholders, they're looking at more local outcomes related to water availability or quality, for example. And that framework reflects well what we found when we looked into the literature. So all kinds of financing sources or mechanisms have been applied to all the types of incentive mechanisms that we have in the literature. So we have funds coming to be applied for subsidies or tax break or payment for ecosystem services and so on. And these incentive mechanisms, they can go to every kind of beneficiaries as well. And the approach supported, they reflect more the economic side of these initiatives. So there's a lot of initiatives that are focusing on sustainable practices and afforestation as well. That's a great part of it. A great deal of the programs still focus on forest conservation, and there's this beginning to happen, the use of these incentive mechanisms to apply to natural regrowth. When we look at the factors that are affecting the implementation of these incentive mechanisms, what we can see straight away is that the social aspects of it, they play a strong role in defining if this initiative will be successful or not. So most of the factors cited by the papers, they are related to the social part of it. And here I try to highlight some examples of factors that are either playing a role as a constraint or as an enabler, depending on the context. So the topography, if the area is a steep slope or a difficult terrain, it would be favored to agriculture or to natural regrowth. If the payments are sufficient or if they're too small to guarantee the program uptake. The tenure security, which also plays a role in defining if the farmer will be participating or not, and program monitoring if it's present or not. So in relation to the outcomes that these programs, these incentive mechanisms are achieving, when we look at it, the intended outcomes or what they wanted to achieve, it's largely focused on ecological outcomes. The three more important are soil conservation or health improvement, and biodiversity conservation, water quality, and availability improvement. But when we look at the outcomes that have been reported, either negative or positive, we have a more prominent participation of social and economic factors in play. So, hey, for example, income generation or livelihoods improvement are cited as outcomes, even if they were not originally the intended outcomes of the program. So the take-home message that the social aspects in planning and implementing incentive mechanisms, they are usually overlooked. We haven't been paying attention to that. However, it's very important for the success of the initiatives. The intended and the outcomes, when you look at it, we see a serious mismatch between intended and reported outcomes. So we should be focusing more on social and economic aspects since the beginning as well. And many studies, they lack a baseline or control groups that could be giving us a more certainty about having these outcomes strictly related to the initiatives that we've been applying and not just by chance happening there. And also that incentive mechanisms could be potentially useful for natural regrowth promotion and persistence. And we see most of the resources being applied for other strategies that would achieve less outcomes for carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation, such as afforestation, for example. And I wish I could leave you just with a beautiful photo of natural regeneration, but today I also would like to acknowledge the work of all my colleagues in Brazil that have been working throughout the last year during pandemic. They keep doing restoration. They keep going to the field. I have a team going to the field, doing interviews for my PhD day, and it's not been easy for them. This is Eva. He had worked his past 12 years in restoration in Brazil, and unfortunately, he passed away this Monday from COVID in a country that has money to fight pandemic, but doesn't do so because of politics. So thank you, and thank you for everyone that works for restoration here and there.
Thank you so much. We do have time for questions. So does anybody have any questions? Anazelia? I have a question. Maybe you can go back to it.
Yeah.
In your slide, and you're looking at natural regeneration that has already started. That one?
Yep.
I was wondering if you know why, for example, the Americas have like such a high rate of natural regrowth when you compare it to the Asia Pacific and Africa. Like, why is that pattern happening regionally?
Yeah,
Do you know?
these are actually the incentive mechanisms being applied. So natural
Okay.
regeneration, but it is higher in the tropics,
Okay.
and the higher rate of natural regeneration is in the Brazilian Amazon. So there's a potential of, they talk about like many millions of hectares that could be restored through natural regeneration. But this also reflects the countries that have been applying large-scale restoration for the past years and that have been using incentive mechanisms lately.
Yeah. So it's not just that they have a massive forest, it's also that they're incentivizing it.
Exactly.
Okay. Does anybody, oh yeah, another question?
Thank you for that very interesting talk. I was struck by that graph that you showed earlier with the large number of incentive programs in China and Brazil.
Oh, yeah.
Can you
Oops.
talk a little bit about what the incentive programs in China are about?
Yeah. So China has also a large land use change program, and it's focused in forest restoration, but also grassland restoration. It's controversial because they don't publish some part of the information, like where are the funding for that coming from. So in the other graph, when I have not informed for the financing source, it's largely because of China. But this program, it's controversial also because they've been using afforestation. So in many areas, there was no forest before, and they have been planting forest in grasslands. So, but it's the largest payment for ecosystem services in the world nowadays. Yeah.
Any other questions for Anazelia before we finish up this session? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.